It's always interesting to figure out what to do with passages we are so familiar with. And since this is one we come back to pretty much every year about this time, it's one, no doubt, that many of us have heard. And I'm guessing nobody's hearing for the first time, though I suppose I could be wrong about that. When we picture this scene, and when we picture things in our head, or when we picture this scene like in art, or every once in a while like in movies, we tend to picture this as a very sort of like almost reverent time, right? So even the art of the day, or the art that followed, kind of depicts this in almost a sort of stoic sort of way. So some of the movies I've seen, everybody is, they're either smiling or they're looking, it's all very quiet, or it's one of those things, right? But it's a very kind of somber, usually reflective sort of thing, is how often this is portrayed in different ways. That's probably not, and almost guaranteed not, how it actually was. One of the questions that I always had about this scene was, why is it that everybody just happened to be waiting around for this parade to start? Did they know it was going to happen? Again, they don't have telephone or radio or television or anything like that. And it turns out, in a way, they kind of were, because these parades happened at Passover all the time. Passover was the festival of all festivals. There were several times a year when Jews would gather at the temple to do special things, but Passover is sort of the OG festival out of all of them, right? The first Passover was celebrated with Moses while they were still wandering the desert. So if there was a time you were going to go to Jerusalem for a Passover, it was Passover, and everybody knew that's where the biggest crowd would be. Everybody knew that's where you wanted to be. So people would actually be progressing in all throughout the week leading up to it. Jesus just becomes one of them. Now, I love the first part of this where they go and they're like, because apparently Jesus doesn't have his own donkey, he has to go borrow one. And he goes and they find one where they expect to find one, and they go and they take it. And I love that the explanation is the Lord needs it. Like, me, if it's my donkey, I'm going to need a little more than that. Donkeys are incredibly important to the people of Jerusalem today. Everything that today you would do with like a tractor or an ATV or something like that, at that time you did with a donkey, if you were lucky enough to even have a donkey. Otherwise, most of the time, if you were plowing your fields, you were probably doing it by hand. Right? So when somebody comes and takes your donkey, not only your donkey, but, the baby of your donkey, they're basically taking your entire livelihood, and something that is very important and no doubt precious to you. So I kind of wonder sometimes, how this actually went down, right? Because they don't even say which Lord they mean, because at this point there are several, right? I mean, there's some people who would use that title. There were Roman lords and there were Jewish lords, and there was all kinds of people that would call themselves Lord. So did this person really understand who it was that was borrowing their donkey? I don't know. I've heard it argued sometimes that Jesus at this point is essentially a horse thief. Might be getting a far, but the circumstances are strange. Let's just leave it at that. But they do manage to secure the donkey, and they bring it back, and then they process in with it in that kind of scene that we imagine. Now, like I said, in this time and in this place, there would have been all sorts of processionals. I'll get the word right at some point. All sorts of professionals coming in from different people, including very, very important people. It was not uncommon for Roman governors and generals to visit at this time, because if there's going to be a time and a place where all of your subjects are gathering of one particular type, so if there's going to be a time and a place where all of your Jewish subjects are gathering, or a good number of them are, it's a really good time to remind them who's in charge. So when the Romans roll in, they roll in like the Romans do. And of course, we have a lot of art and their own sculptures of this time. So we know how they came in. They did not come in, spoiler, on donkeys. They came in with great fanfare, with great shows of wealth, with great shows of force, with great shows of power to remind everybody who the most important people are. And it was the people riding in on chariots like this being pulled by amazing horses. So when Jesus rides in the way that he does, this is a very intentional act to do something that was both like what the Romans do in their processing and also very much not like what they do. And in fact, the scripture gives us a hint in there where it says he was to fulfill up the prophecy about the Lord riding in, but it doesn't say the Lord rode in triumphantly. It said, if you heard it, the Lord rode in humbly. This is where I start to have an exception with most of our modern Bible translators and authors, because if you look at most modern Bibles in this section, it'll usually have a title for this section called Jesus' Triumphal Entry into Jerusalem. That is not in the scripture. The people who wrote the Bible added that, and that's one of those places where I'm just going to go ahead and tell you they're wrong. This was not ever meant to be a triumphal entry. One of the ways that we know that is that the story we read today actually pretty much immediately precedes the story we dealt with last week with the mom. So last week, you remember the mom said, "Oh, I want my sons to come sit at your right hand and your left hand so that everybody knows they're the most important people." And Jesus' response is, "That's not how it works. The most important people are the ones who don't want to be important. I did not come here to be exalted. I came here to serve." So when he rides in as a donkey, this is not a triumphal act. It's not a kingly act. It's nothing like that. He rides in on a donkey to show that he is there to serve. He is a person of the people. He is actually not there to be exalted. He is there to do what he said he needed to do. Now, in the Roman world, they also had a couple other things going on, well, a lot of things going on. And one of the things that makes even the detail about it being a donkey even more important is that one of the reasons that the Romans looked down on the Jews is because the Jews tended to use donkeys for most of their work. And in the Roman world, what you really wanted was you wanted horses or you wanted mules. And the only reason to have donkeys around, as far as the Romans were concerned, is that you need donkeys to make mules. Because you need donkeys and horses combined to apparently make a mule. I don't know how that works. There are veterinarians in the audience, they can tell you. But apparently that's what happens. The problem is those mules apparently can't have little baby mules, so you have to keep the donkeys and the horses around, and everyone's, right, I'm looking for confirmation. Okay, good. I know a lot of things, not one. And so most of the time, and the reason why is that mules are kind of some ways the best of both worlds. They're almost as strong as a horse, but they're actually fairly docile, but they're not as they're not as random as donkeys are. So at this time, the standard mode of transport and the thing that the Roman world and Roman army relies on more than anything is mules. They literally have millions of them at this time. And a small supply of donkeys to make more mules. And then, of course, the really, really rich and powerful people get horses because you really can't afford those because they're expensive, even today. Talk to anybody who has a horse. They're expensive. Yeah. So they would look down on the Jews for using donkeys as basically inferior tools because the basic understanding was that donkeys were basically underpowered, unreliable, and occasionally dangerous. Basically like the Ford Pinto of the first century. Which really kind of works if you know what Pinto means. All right, so they maybe should have just called it the Ford Donkey. That would have been better. So when Jesus rides in on a donkey, he's making a very, very particular statement about it, about who he is and what he's about, and also who he is not and what he is not about. Jesus, no doubt, could have gained access to a mule or a horse if he wanted to, but he intentionally chooses the mode of transportation that he chooses because his calling and the prophecy was not that he entered triumphally. It was that he entered humbly, that he entered as a servant, the servant he just got done explaining to all of his disciples he came to be and he was asking them to be. So no doubt, those who gathered along the way were celebrating. Those who knew who Jesus was, they were excited to see him. But it is also no doubt that a lot of the other visitors who were there, especially the Roman Gentile visitors who were there, were no doubt looking at this with a bit of sneer on their face, going, "This is the guy? The guy on a donkey? This is the one they're relying on? I'm not worried." Jesus doesn't stop there. Oftentimes when we read this passage, we stop here. But in Matthew's version especially, it's important to keep going because not only does he ride in Jerusalem, but as Dane so ably put it in the puppet script, he got off his donkey and got to work. Of course, the work that he ended up doing was going into the temple and turning over all the tables, right? And this is done for a very particular reason. So if you are going to Jerusalem at Passover, it's probably the only time you're going to be at the temple, and there are certain things, as a good Jew, you are required to do, certain sacrifices you are required to make every year. So you would do that when you happen to be there, so you would do it at Passover. Oftentimes, the things you are called on to do require you to offer up some sort of sacrifice of grain or maybe a small animal or something like that that you would offer at the temple, and then they would go offer it on your behalf later. Now, if you're walking a great distance, I don't know about you, but it does not sound fun to me to walk a great distance to the temple carrying a bird, right? Especially random pigeon you found on the side of the road, and like in some makeshift cage. Like, that does not sound like the best traveling companion. So most people didn't do that because they're walking and they want to travel light. So they would just buy it when they get there. And much like popcorn at the movies, when you get there and you are a captive audience and you don't have any other choice, you can imagine what happens to the prices. And so what should be a service, what should be a convenience, what should be something that is actually enabling people to do their religious duty and should be treated in that way, is instead treated, again, like popcorn at the movies. And people are being asked for exorbitant sums for what they need to offer up their sacrifices that, honestly, most of the time, don't actually get sacrificed and just make themselves way back down to the table to be sold to the next person. This was an incredibly common practice at the time. And not only that, but you couldn't actually buy the things with the regular money you use every day because that had Caesar's image on it. You weren't allowed to do that. So there was another vendor who would kindly sell you the kind of money you needed to buy the thing. So you're paying an exorbitant exchange rate to buy the money you need to then go buy the thing that's marked up 300, 400, 500%. So when Jesus says, "You have made my house into a den of robbers," he means it. They have turned this into a circus. And he takes very public and dramatic action in a way that he has not done before. This is the most confrontational that we have seen Jesus this entire time. And he's doing it right in the heart of the power of both the Jews and the Romans in the world. Jesus is poking the bear, and he knows it. So while we like to think about this in a certain way, the truth of Palm Sunday is that Jesus steals a donkey, mocks the rich, and then tries to incite a riot. He was not successful in inciting the riot, and I don't know if that was his intention. But we can start to see why this day sets up everything that's going to happen in the week to come, because this is also the first time we've seen Jesus be directly confrontational to the actual leaders, the actual people in charge. Before now, he's always been in the periphery. He's always been in the rural areas when he's tangling with religious leaders, their local religious leaders or their lawyers or things like that. He has yet to go to the center to confront the actual people, the actual head priest, the actual Roman governor, all those people that we're going to read about later on in the story at Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday and everything that happens there. There is a reason that Jesus has not gone to those people yet and has not tangled with those people yet. And of course, the reason is he knows exactly what's going to happen once he does. And since we know where the story goes, we know what happens and exactly what happens when he does. This is an important moment because Jesus recognizes, his mission was not just to simply run in, make a bunch of people mad, and get killed. He spent actually many years before that working and organizing amongst the people, making sure that he had the opportunity to teach and heal and tell people what they needed to know, made sure that there was a broad group of support around him, that there would be people who knew what it is he was trying to do. He needed the disciples because he knew there would need to be a next generation of leaders. This was an incredibly intentional, long-term, very difficult process to make sure that everything else was in place before Jesus finally went to confront those that everybody knew he was eventually going to have to confront. Because he also knew that even though this is Jesus, that as soon as he did that, that would be the end of it for him. And if he hadn't built that base of support, hadn't built up that messaging, hadn't got the word out there as broadly as he did, then there's a thought that maybe we are not here today because there weren't enough people to share the stories. Jesus' ministry and life and all those stories we spent the rest of Lent looking at are incredibly important and are really the reason that we get to be blessed in the way that we are blessed today. All right. Big surprise, we're going to talk about something completely different for a minute. I have a quiz for you. Some of you already know the answer to this because we talked about it in a Bible study a couple weeks ago, so shush. But do you happen to know, does anybody happen to venture a guess where the most expensive piece of real estate in the world is? Dubai? Close. Nope. Jerusalem? Nope. I will tell you, maybe you will not be surprised, it's actually in Washington, D.C. And by the way, most expensive is a little arguable, I understand that. But what is arguably the most expensive piece of real estate in the United States is in Washington, D.C., and it's here on the map. Nope, because that's public, you can't buy that. So if you look at that map, I circled the area where it is. This little area, chunk of real estate right here is across the street from the Capitol building, across the street from the Supreme Court building, and across the street from the main office building where all the Congress people work. That little area there has a building on it that is known as the United Methodist Building. It is the only privately held piece of property on Capitol Hill. I don't know how much money we've been offered for it. We all politely decline. And was built in the early 19-teens, actually before the contemporary Supreme Court building was built. The Methodist Church got together and bought that piece of property because they recognized that being in that place and being able to advocate from that place would have advantages that no other place would let them have. And while everybody else who owns private property anywhere near that has eventually sold out to the government because they can write really big checks, the last one remaining is the United Methodist Building. And in case you're wondering, we are really good at sharing. So the United Methodist Building is not only home to United Methodist Ministries, it's home to Catholic Relief Services, the Baltimore-Washington Episcopal Office. So if you're the bishop of the Baltimore-Washington Conference, that's where your office is. Pretty sweet. Church World Service, Episcopalian, Church Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, Lutheran Services of America, and the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, amongst many else. It's very well-used space. We give generous leasing rates to all these organizations. It's also the only place in the entire area where you can rent a private conference room, for either tenants or outsiders. So if you want to have a private conference in Washington, D.C. with a conference room for $350, which is actually a pretty good deal, you can rent a conference room in this building that is across the street from the Capitol and where all the Congress people are. You will often see, because it is on the main travel route between the Capitol and where a lot of the congressmen are, you will often see congressmen tweet out pictures of the little, they have like one of those like church signs, with little things on it, like a lot of churches have, like little plastic things. And they sometimes put stuff up there, and it's sometimes funny because Congress people will drive by, take a picture of it, and either like support or object to whatever it is they put on that sign that day. And it's always kind of funny. Anyway, that building was built there, and in case you're wondering, it actually wasn't built by the Methodist Church. It was built by the United Methodist Women because they're smarter than the rest of us. It was a campaign from all across the United States to build the building with some donations literally of 15 cents being mailed in, but 1910, that 15 cents went a little further. And they built it for a reason. Not just for generic advocacy. They built it for a reason because at that point, one of the big things the United Methodist Women was doing was advocating for prohibition. And they recognized if they wanted to get prohibition passed, they'd have to have a continual presence and that this building would let them do that. And in fact, the original charter for the building was to be a place that would advocate for prohibition, which most of us know was passed and then unpassed not so much time later. You will often find people say that prohibition is one of those examples of a failure, right? That prohibition was a failure. It didn't do what it set out to do. It didn't actually achieve anything. Prohibition gave us the mob. These are the arguments you will hear. The problem with those arguments is that they misunderstand what the point was when prohibition was being advocated for, especially be advocated for in the church. At the time, before prohibition was here, there was basically no regulations of alcohol in the United States. You could basically do what you wanted. And there was a common practice whereby, especially around factories would open up, they'd employ a bunch of people, and then the factories would buy the land immediately outside the factory and build a bunch of bars on them. And those bars were just for men. Saloons before Prohibition were pretty much always exclusively just for men, unless you were a woman working there in some capacity or another. And otherwise, and they were encouraged, they were open. They were open before work, so you could get a drink on your way in. They were open at lunch, and they were open after work. One of the reasons that companies standardized on Friday being payday is because they wanted their guy workers to walk out of their factories with a large wad of cash and a weekend coming up and walk right by their bars, which would be full of all kinds of fun things. And it was not uncommon, and in fact, it was incredibly common, in fact, for most, if not all, of the paycheck to not actually make it home. If you look at the actual literature of what was being promoted when it talked about Prohibition and why it is that we needed it, those are the stories you would hear about. It wasn't that alcohol is intrinsically evil. Jesus turned water into wine, for goodness sakes. It was that the consequence of it and the way that it was practiced in this country was visiting a lot of harm, and it was visiting a lot of harm on the weakest and poorest members of society. And it was, in fact, the richest factory owners and all of those sort of titans who were actually making all the money on it. They had basically set up a system around these factories in places that was not unlike the temple. It was designed to make sure they could give you as little as possible and extract as much from you as possible. That was the setup in most places. The problem with taking that on directly is the people who run the factories and own these businesses are incredibly powerful. And at the same time, right before Prohibition, for pretty much all of U.S. history, right before Prohibition, 40% of the federal budget came from taxes on alcohol, because income tax didn't exist until about 2 years before Prohibition was passed. So you have the government with all of its power, and you've got all these rich people with all of this power, heavily invested in keeping things the way that they are. And the women of the church said, wait a minute, something's getting lost in this. And what is getting lost in this is the health of the family, the health of the children, the opportunity for people, because you have rigged the system to make sure that as little as possible comes home, which of course leads to a whole bunch of other terrible things happening at home. There wasn't really a way to talk about these issues, and when they started to talk about it in terms of Prohibition, suddenly you could talk about the issues, you could talk about what's happening, you could talk about domestic violence in a way that you couldn't talk about before, because you weren't actually blaming the men, you were blaming the booze. And suddenly people would start to at least a little bit listen to what was happening. Prohibition was always a women's rights movement. It was that way from the beginning, and that was always what it was about. It was a backdoor, side door way of getting a conversation started that desperately needed to start. So there are actually two consequences of Prohibition. One is we have a lot more. When it was repealed, it was returned to the states, and the states started regulating alcohol in a way that the women were actually originally asking for, and were told no. After Prohibition, the states were willing, because they had heard all the stories, to start regulating alcohol, regulating where it can be sold, regulate who can sell it, breaking up these things where factories would own bars and things like that. And that's where you get all the regulation today. The other consequence of it is that during Prohibition and after, there was a dramatic decrease in domestic violence. Dramatic. And in fact, the rates have never returned to the pre-Prohibition rates of reported. And understanding at the time, most of it actually wasn't reported. So depending on what you think that process was for, it was either successful or it was very unsuccessful. In my mind, and I think in the mind of the people who were organizing and advocating it from the first place, it actually accomplished what it is we wanted to accomplish. After Prohibition, it was much, much easier, not completely easy, but much easier to talk about things that previously we weren't able to talk about. Of course, it also helped that the women got the right to vote. That helped too. Happened all about the same time. If the women had just simply gone, if the people had just certainly gone straight to those people in power and authority, they never would have got anywhere. What they smartly did is go around, tell their stories, build up a base of support, help people understand what it is they were trying to do, help people understand why it was important, help people understand what the purpose of all this was. And even though history has sort of lost all of that, the fact that they did that is what helped them to be successful at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, the problem that they faced is the same problem that Jesus faced, is that oftentimes we don't like hearing or want to hear things that are inconvenient for us to hear. The women who were advocating at the time needed to find a way to help people actually listen and hear the things that they needed to hear, even if they didn't want to hear them. Jesus had the same problem. He needed to help people hear the thing that they needed to hear, even though especially the people in power and authority didn't want to hear it. Jesus found a way to do that, same as the women did. I think today one of the things that we often struggle with is we can all fall kind of victim to doing the same thing. We like our world to look a certain way. We don't like our assumptions about how the world works to be challenged. We don't want to think about things that we think are unpleasant or, that happen over there. Jesus was able to break through that. The women of the church, along with many other people, were willing to break through that. And because they broke through that, we get to live in a far better world than we were. But it's hard. And we must confess that while we would like to think of ourselves as the ones who would be the crusaders, we are oftentimes in the position of the other. This season challenges us. Jesus challenges us. Our faith challenges us to not always dwell in our assumptions about the world and how it is, to always be open to hearing and new things from new people who may have an experience different than ours, and to recognize that even though things might be generally good in our little circle, they may not be good everywhere. And we may actually have a part or some work to do in making it better. That is hard work. It is important work. And it's how we go about doing the work that God calls us to do through Christ, the work of building God's kingdom. Amen.
Great sermon.